I'm John Richter. I have the privilege of serving as the chair of the Criminal Law and Procedure Executive Committee for the Federalist Society. And it's my privilege to introduce this panel, and in particular introduce the leader of this panel, the Honorable Beth Williams. I won't get into her biography too deeply. I will say that it's a darn impressive one. She obviously has hit all her marks academically, clerked for the right judges, and been involved in confirmations of judges to the United States Supreme Court and otherwise, and obviously most recently, prior to her present position, served as the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Office of Legal Policy at the U.S. Department of Justice, which of course plays a critical role. Presently, she serves as a board member of the U.S. Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. As obviously we're dealing with debates presently in Congress over Section 702, the debate of the balance between ensuring we keep ourselves protected against terrorism and foreign threats and preserving our civil liberties remains an active issue. But obviously today we are focusing a panel on the issue of the border and immigration and the question of overreach and underreach. I'm going to make a bet that this panel will agree that there is both overreach and underreach when it comes to executive, state, and local authority pertaining to this issue. I suspect they will not agree on what is overreach and what is underreach. But without further ado, let me introduce the Honorable Beth Williams and look forward to hearing the panel today. Thank you so much for participating and doing this.
Great. Thank you so much, John. I'm really happy to be here, and I have to start with just the quick disclaimer that I'm here in my personal capacity, and any views expressed don't reflect the views of the U.S. government or the board or any other board member. But with that, I am really excited to welcome our wonderful panelists, who are all very distinguished, and I'll give you some brief introductions so that we have some more time for discussion. So let's start with Attorney General Mark Brnovich, all the way on the left. So Mark Brnovich served as Arizona's 26th Attorney General from 2015 to 2023 and is now a partner at Boies Schiller Flexner. He was first inaugurated as Arizona's Attorney General in 2015 and again in 2019 after winning re-election. Attorney General Brnovich has spent most of his professional life serving as a prosecutor at the local, state, and federal levels. He's been a judge pro tem of Maricopa County Superior Court, a command staff judge advocate in the U.S. Army National Guard, and the director for constitutional government at the Goldwater Institute. On behalf of the state of Arizona, he's been a litigant in cases at the Supreme Court involving immigration issues. He recently testified on the southern border crisis before the U.S. House Subcommittee on the Constitution and Limited Government. While in office, he served as the chairman of the Conference of Western Attorneys General and personally argued 3 cases before the United States Supreme Court. Next, we have Professor Ilya Somin. Professor Somin is professor of law at George Mason University. His research focuses on constitutional law, property law, democratic theory, federalism, and migration rights. Among many other publications, he is author of Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom, and Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter. Professor Somin's work has appeared in numerous scholarly journals, and his writings have been cited in decisions by the United States Supreme Court and multiple lower courts. Professor Somin clerked on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit. He earned his bachelor's summa cum laude at Amherst in political science his master's in political science from Harvard University, and his JD from Yale Law School. And next we have Dr. Sohan Dasgupta. He is currently a partner at Staff, Stettinius, and Hollister in its DC office, and he's the former Deputy General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and I hear they handle immigration matters. He also served as Special Counsel of the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. Dasgupta earned his undergraduate degree from Columbia University, his law degree from the University of California at Berkeley, where he was elected to the Order of the Coif, and his master's from the University of Oxford. He served as a clerk on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of West Virginia. Please join me in welcoming these wonderful panelists. So we're going to start with some opening statements, and to kick it off will be Attorney General Brnovich.
Thank you very much. And I must admit, as you were doing the introduction, I couldn't help but thinking about one of the times I had introduced the late Justice Scalia at an event. And if you know Justice Scalia, he had that kind of gravelly voice and was short and to the point. And I had asked him, I said, how would you like me to introduce you? And he said, Mark, have you ever heard the President of the United States introduced? And I said, yeah, what are you talking about? And because you've done all this stuff, you're a law professor, appellate judge, Supreme Court judge. And he says, when they introduce the president, all they say is, here he is, the President of the United States, because the more important your job, the shorter the introduction. So thank you for that lengthy introduction of all of us. I really do appreciate that. I know where we stand now. So in all seriousness, this is a very, very serious issue regarding the crisis, the invasion, whatever you want to call it, at our southern border. And the reality is, by any measure, it is unprecedented. Frankly, on Joe Biden's first day in office, he issued executive orders which help incentivize and decriminalize illegal entry into our country. I think the Biden administration's lack of concern for the security of our southern border knows no bounds, no boundaries, literally and figuratively. I remember early on, while I was still Attorney General, in President Biden's first year in office, talking about the crisis at our southern border, I would say things like, every state is going to be a border state, something you hear now being echoed by people across the political spectrum. I used to talk about the unprecedented nature. And I would try, as a former trial attorney, a former prosecutor, I would always try to put things in perspective that people could understand. And I remember that first year, as we were nearing the 1 million mark in less than a year under Joe Biden's presidency, I remember being on Fox News and saying, this border crisis, literally, if you look at the amount of people that have illegally entered our country, it could literally fill the entire population of Alaska and Wyoming, 2 states. Now, I think most people here recognize that those are smaller states, so let me put that in perspective as we fast forward a couple years later. Now we're talking about 13 million people by some estimates, enough to fill Joe Biden's home state of Delaware 8 times over, enough to fill the stadium where the Baltimore Ravens play 100 times over. So these are astronomical numbers we're talking about when it comes just in the form of the number of people illegally entering our country. Now, do I think everyone entering our country illegally right now means harm to the United States? No, but I also know that every single person that enters our country illegally is putting money into the pockets of the cartels. The cartels literally, depending on what the going rate is, will make thousands of dollars off every single person entering into this country illegally. Since this border crisis began under the Joe Biden administration, we are talking about billions of dollars. And anybody that cares about the national security of the United States, who has been to countries like Mexico, should recognize Mexico is on the brink of becoming a failed state. And quite frankly, it might already be in the category of a narco state. Now, all that being said, when we talk about the raw numbers, there's obviously a cost in this associated to states, Arizona, Texas, other border states. I'll give you a quick an example. Just last week, I was talking to a senior healthcare official, and this person was telling me that their hospital that's along the southern border of the United States, the amount of people they are having to treat now and see that don't have health insurance, that the hospitals essentially are picking up the cost, is astronomical. If you listen to the mayor of Yuma, Arizona, he will tell you that in the average quarter, they're talking about $20 million of these small regional hospitals in rural parts of the country that are having to absorb these astronomical costs. And this healthcare executive was telling me that when people come into the country, sometimes they illegally. Sometimes they'll hop over the border fence. They get caught in, barricades, or they become dehydrated after trekking through the desert. Whatever happens, DHS will drop them off at the local hospital. They'll agree to pay for a couple of days of health care. And many times, people with significant injuries end up staying in the hospital for a month at a time. And then they just walk out with no bill. And the reason why that matters is because I think so many people that I know that are immigrants that went through the legal process, it really bothers them that so many people now, and it's building this resentment, that so many people now seemingly come here, and the hardest question they get asked when they enter this country illegally at the southern border is whether they want a hotel room with 1 king bed or 2 queen beds. And I say that half in jest, but that's the reality. I mean, you look at what's happening in places like New York and Chicago. Literally, there's people that have entered the country illegally that are getting gift cards. And I'm going to tell you another anecdote in a second related to that, but this is the point I wanted to make. And I don't know if there's a timer here, how much time I have or don't have, but what should bother or what should worry everyone in this room is not just the millions of people entering this country illegally and whether our system can absorb it financially and the empowerment and the enrichment of the cartels. But what keeps me up at night as a former gang prosecutor, as an Arizonan, is the gotaways. And this is a term that's used in DHS and the Border Patrol community. These are people that are evading capture. These are people that don't want to be caught. So of that big group of people, literally, if you go to the southern border, and I've been there many a time, people will literally just walk across the border with backpacks, with carry-on luggage. You will get more of a hassle going through TSA security at the airport than they do coming in through the border. They literally are processed, and they go to this van, and then they know where they're off to. They get paperwork to report in 4 or 5 years, and it's a fairly easy process right now to enter the country illegally. All that being said, ask yourself, why is it since Joe Biden took over as president, there have been nearly or more than 1 million gotaways? The gotaways are primarily, almost exclusively, males between the ages of 18 to 35 years old, very often wearing dark clothes, camouflage clothes. They wear carpet on their feet usually so that way they can't be tracked to avoid detection. So ask yourself, if you could enter this country right now without any sort of legal consequences, even getting government benefits, why have 1 million people, males between the ages of 13 and 35, done everything they can to avoid capture and detection? And that's what keeps me up at night, because we know that since Joe Biden took office, a record amount of people on the terror watch list have been apprehended. We know that in places like southern Arizona, people that are under the age of 18 now, the number of overdose deaths has gone from about 4% to 57% of the deaths. We know, and I think Speaker Johnson is speaking at this conference later, he's mentioned the fact that the #1 cause of deaths among people in the age group 18 to 49 now is opioid and fentanyl overdoses. So we have a record amount of drugs coming into the country. We have record amount of profits for the cartels. And we have more than 1 million people in this country that snuck in, that are of military age, and we have no idea who they are or where they're going. And so that is what should concern everyone. So that brings us to what our office did. We had issued an opinion, the first in the country, that basically says what is going on our southern border constitutes an invasion. Now, when we issued this opinion, there was a lot of blowback, a lot of criticism. And, quite frankly put, and I know there's going to be more discussion on this, but the reality is that the states created the federal government. The federal government didn't create the states. And there are all sorts of references in our Constitution to that sovereignty and those powers the states still retained. And if you look at specifically Article 1, Section 10, a state has the ability to defend itself when actually invaded or in such imminent danger. Additionally, Article 4, Section 4 provides the United States shall protect each state against an invasion. So, quite simply put, when the federal government will not do its job, the states have the ability to protect themselves. And the reality is that this doesn't come easy for someone like me, especially as a first-generation American. I understand that when it comes to national defense, foreign policy, immigration policy, that is when the executive is at the height of his or her powers. But what we've seen thus far is an abject failure of the Biden administration. So whether it was, incentivizing by getting rid of the public charge rule, which our office sued the president over, whether it was failure to build the border wall, which apparently now they're going to start building. There's a myriad of things the Biden administration did to incentivize and essentially decriminalize illegal border crossing and illegal migration. So if the federal government won't do its job, the states have the ability to protect themselves. And let me just close with one last story. As I said, I'm a first-generation American, and a lot of people that go to the church, attend the church I go to, are either refugees or first-generation Americans as well. And one day, as I was walking out of church, someone I know, a friend of mine from Chicago, whose family, he was born actually in the former Yugoslavia, and came up to me, and I thought he was going to troll me or whatever, say something nasty about my stance because related to the border. And instead, he came up to me and he said, "Thank you for all you're doing." And I said, "Well, I'm kind of surprised. You're a Democrat, you're from Chicago. I thought you would be against, what we're doing on the border." And he said, "No, absolutely not." He goes, "You know what Cesar Chavez said about immigration, do you?" And I said, "Cesar Chavez, the migrant rights worker who Joe Biden literally has a bust of Cesar Chavez in his office?" And he said, "Yes, that's Cesar Chavez." He goes, "Go back and look it up," which I did. Cesar Chavez and his brother were adamantly opposed to illegal immigration. In fact, his brother, they would do patrols along the southern Arizona and California border and beat up people that were trying to enter the country illegally because they felt, and they came at it from a left perspective, they felt that when people were coming into the country illegally, that would mean that they would be exploited, that it would undermine the ability of farm workers, auto workers, anyone else that was working in blue-collar jobs to be able to earn a better standard of living because corporate America would hire, cheap labor. Now, putting aside the economics of that argument, I can't help, as he was talking to me, think about what Milton Friedman also said, that you can't have open immigration policies if you have a welfare state. And so the reality is that, look, there's a lot of people, including myself, that have benefited from a legal immigration policy. But there's a lot of people that are in this country legally who really don't like what's going on. They feel like if I could add $1 for every time I heard someone say, "Well, no one gave me money to go visit my cousin in New York. No one gave me a free gift card. No one's paying for my hotel rooms, my health care," And I think that what is happening is fundamentally unfair to everyone. I actually think it stigmatizes immigrants in a bad way as we move forward as a country. And I think that when you see these numbers, we have to keep in mind, every one of those numbers, those millions of numbers, means someone was exploited, taken advantage of, and the cartels are getting richer, and drugs, illegal drugs, are flowing into this country, and every single day we are paying a price, not only fiscally, but in lost lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney General. Now we're going to go with Dr. Dasgupta.
Thank you very much for your gracious invitation, and I'm honored to be here with our venerable moderator and my illustrious co-panelists. We all know that in June of 22, in Biden versus Texas, the Supreme Court held that the present administration's rescission of MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocols, didn't violate the Immigration and Nationality Act. And in June, a year later, the court held in United States versus Texas that the states, Louisiana and the border state of Texas, they lack standing to challenge the current administration's immigration enforcement guidelines that prioritize the arrest and removal of certain non-citizens from the United States. There might actually be a constitutional elephant in the room, and it concerns national security broadly, the border to be sure, but also matters from cybersecurity and biological weapons to combat operations. What has not frontally been addressed by the Supreme Court in recent years is whether the Constitution requires the president to protect our national security, regardless whether the context is to ward off an invasion or something even more insidious, or for the president to do so preemptively. And if so, whether there's an administrable judicial standard to so enforce. Sooner rather than later, the court is going to have to grapple with this issue. Cases echoing that theme have been filed in the lower courts. So the framework to consider that question is very important. To be sure, Justice Thomas has observed in the Guantanamo Bay cases, Hamdan and Hamdi, that the president has broad constitutional authority to protect the nation's security in the manner he deems fit. Justice Thomas has used the word responsibility, which I take as some kind of synonym for duty and obligation. And historically, going back to the mid-19th century, there are the intrabellum prize cases and Fleming versus Page, which say, kind of as dicta, kind of as holding, similar things. In the prize cases, the sufficient condition was, if a war be made by invasion of a foreign nation, the president, this is the necessary condition, is not only authorized but bound to resist force by force without waiting for any special legislative authority. And in Fleming, the court said that the president has the constitutional power to employ the national security means at his disposal in the manner he may deem most effectual to harass and conquer and subdue the enemy. But some might argue that the presidential power to do so is different from the duty to do so, and reacting in the face of an invasion is not the same thing as being commanded to do so proactively and preemptively. On that side of the ledger, judicial pragmatism sort of reigns supreme. Either we, the judges, run the country's security, or the executive, with all the resources at its disposal, does so, and we are just not well equipped to do this. And there's just too much riding on it for we judges to meddle in this most sensitive of preserves. Often goes the judicial thinking. How could the judges know what is a genuine national security interest, national security basis, and what is mere obfuscation or pretext? How could the judges choose between competing claims, with the president arguing that his inaction potentially advanced national security and the challengers arguing that it hurt the same? Judges are not in the situation room. They might be able to construe only a very limited quantum of the vital national security information in camera. They don't know the ponderous equities that are weighing on the executive's mind. They don't know if even an ostensibly minimalist judicial intervention can have disproportionate ramifications in the national security theater. They don't know the cost-benefit analyses and trade-offs. They don't want to stage manage national security from the bench. And for these reasons, in the Supreme Court's own words, the judiciary has neither aptitude, facilities, or responsibility to stage manage national security, which belongs in the domain of political power, not subject to judicial intrusion or inquiry. And two other pragmatic considerations seem to make judges reluctant to weigh in on some of these questions. Because national security is so prominent and volatile a topic, voters will know expeditiously whether it was a good call or a bad call, and the remedy is a political one. They can vote the president or his party. They can punish the president or his party at the polls. And secondly, once the judges enter the national security thicket, sort of like the political thicket, they would be stuck there against a recalcitrant executive. And if they have to sound a retreat sooner or later due to executive inertia, which is not out of the question, then that might embarrass, lead to mockery, and irreparably damage the structural integrity of the judiciary. That said, it's appropriate to examine the school of thought which believes that the president does have these constitutional obligations, even if, in the view of some of the proponents of that school, beyond some point the federal courts either may not or prudentially should not intrude in national security matters. After all, the president and members of Congress take the same oath that judges do, and not all duties and rights given by the Constitution are judicially enforceable because of justiciability or other obstacles. And those that the courts decline to enforce, Congress may enforce through all the tools that are at its disposal. Appropriations, refusal to confirm nominees, ambassadors, State Department official granting letters or withholding letters of mark and reprisal, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, they argue that many of these preceding arguments are red herrings, hyper-focused on the borderline difficult cases, because most of the time, whether the president has hurt or advanced our national security will be reasonably clear, both to Congress and to judges. And they also say that judges don't apply this even-handedly. They're very tendentious about it. Sometimes national security is just sort of is an appropriate invocation to decline to adjudicate a case when the subject matter is to the liking of the court, and sometimes not. And under this view, the historical argument is that the living community existing at the time of the Constitution's framing committed that power and duty to the president. Only he could do the job right in numerous national security circumstances and therefore must do so. The executive vesting clause of our Constitution authorized the president to protect the national security. Commander-in-Chief clause doubled down on that power to protect the nation. But then there's the take care clause. There's the oath clause. What do those clauses do? They convert the power, it is argued, to protect the nation into a duty to do so. For the Constitution itself will not endure in any meaningful way if the nation itself does not endure and its security does not endure. According to this view, the executive's failure to protect our national security contravenes the executive's constitutionally appointed duty. And that's from the majority opinion, not Justice Scalia's dissent. I know the general very graciously brought up Justice Scalia earlier in Morrison versus Olson. And, you know, at least that sheep was allowed to come as a sheep. No dissembling, no camouflage, and the duty to protect national security entails, it is argued, the power to do so, but it imposes an obligation on the executive as well. And it draws some support from late 19th century cases. Probably the most fascinating of these cases, in my view, and I've always thought this case was a significant development in structural constitutional jurisprudence, was Nagel. Nagel's from 1890. And there it was held that the Take Care Clause requires the president to execute any command that is statutory or is treaty-based, or one whose provenance are the rights, duties, and obligations growing out of the Constitution itself, our international relations, and all the protection implied by the nature of government under our Constitution. That's capacious language, and it goes well beyond specifically spelled out rights, duties, and obligations in salient legal instruments. And what could grow more out of the Constitution than the executive obligation to protect our national security? Similarly, what could be more implied by the nature of government under our Constitution, a la Nagel, than the president's national security duty and obligation? The Take Care Clause, in that regard, serves as a bridge between the president and his legal duty, even a general one, with some conceivable root in the Constitution, statutes, or treaties. Similarly, the Oath Clause confers on the president the unqualified absolute obligation to take care that the laws, including the broader national security imperatives to make the country itself stand, are faithfully executed. The equation, I think I've alluded to it earlier, is very simple. If national security is undermined, the existence of the nation may well be undermined, and then there is no question of the laws being faithfully or otherwise executed. The presidential power and duty, the school of thought believes, of protecting our national security go hand in hand. That authority and duty to protect the national security was conceived of by the framers and the living community that so believed. That's why when Hamilton had said that energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government, Federalist 70, he had grounded this in the decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch, which will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number. And although, and since the nation cannot do without national security, not only may the president use all the powers at his disposal, but he must do so. That's the argument, sum and substance thereof. President Lincoln, the proponents of this school of thought point out, did not believe he had any choice. The Constitution required him, he believed, to put down the rebellion. To this end, Lincoln reminded the rebels, "You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor Soman.
Thanks to the Federalist Society for organizing this event and all of you for coming. In my talk, I'd like to focus on two issues. First, the argument advanced by the state of Texas in two cases currently before the courts, which says that illegal migration and cross-border drug smuggling qualify as an invasion under the Constitution, thereby authorizing Texas and other states to engage in war in response. And then second, I'll talk a little bit more broadly about the issues raised by the situation at the border and how they can be best addressed, which in my view is by making legal migration easier, because most of the problems we have at the border are the result of creating an illegal market, which creates predictable incentives for people to do illegally that which is virtually impossible for most of them to do in any other way. So Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 of the Constitution states that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. And I think the invasion being referred to here is pretty obviously a military attack, not merely cross-border drug smuggling or illegal migration. The very text strongly suggests this. What states are allowed to do if there is an invasion is engage in war. That's the kind of thing, normally speaking, you would only be allowed to do or want to do in response to an actual attack, as opposed to various kinds of illegal activity. Moreover, other references in the Constitution to invasion point in the same direction. For example, in Article 4, the Guarantee Clause, it pairs invasion with, quote, domestic violence. Domestic violence in the founding era did not mean what it means today, that is sort of violence in the home between intimate partners or family members. It meant something like a violent rebellion or uprising. So that too, seems like large-scale violent attack, not merely law-breaking of less significant kinds. Similarly, in the suspension clause, which gives the government the power to suspend a writ of habeas corpus, invasion is paired with rebellion as one of the circumstances that would allow suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. And that, too, suggests that it's a matter of large-scale violent attack, not merely illegal migration, drug smuggling, or similar phenomena of that kind. If you look at original meaning evidence, once again, overwhelmingly it shows the founding generation understood invasion as meaning a voluntary attack. James Madison, the founding father who addressed this issue most directly, wrote in his report of 1800, criticizing the Alien and Sedition Act, that invasion is, quote, an operation of war. It's clearly indicating his view that it requires a large-scale violent attack. Moreover, if this argument advanced by Texas in these two cases is accepted, so far courts have uniformly rejected the argument, but both cases are on appeal before the Fifth Circuit. If this argument is accepted, then very dangerous implications follow. One is that states, or at least border states, could initiate war at virtually any time, because since we've had significant immigration restrictions and since we've had the war on drugs, there has never been a year where there has not been hundreds of thousands of people crossing the border illegally or large-scale drug smuggling and the like. There has been more the last 2 or 3 years than in some previous years, but it surely can't be the case that having 1 million a year is enough to qualify as an invasion versus, say, 300,000 a year is not. So it would mean that states could initiate war with their neighbors at virtually any time that they want, and that's obviously dangerous for any number of reasons, and especially in an era when a number of prominent Republican politicians have in fact called for military intervention in Mexico in response to these situations, so it's not just a purely hypothetical or theoretical danger. Another dangerous implication is that, as I mentioned earlier, the federal government has the power to suspend the writ of habeas corpus whenever there is an invasion, and on this reasoning, it could do so anytime it wants, and that means they could detain without trial not just suspected illegal immigrants or drug smugglers, but other people, including U.S. citizens. The suspension power applies to them as well, not just to migrants or to non-citizens, and the federal government would have the power to do this virtually anytime they want. Do you really trust Joe Biden with the power to suspend a writ of habeas corpus anytime he wants? I certainly don't. But even if you do trust Biden, you may not trust the next president, and so on. So this is a very dangerous power that the framers of the Constitution specifically limited to certain extreme circumstances like actual warfare or actual rebellion, as during the Civil War. It is not something that was supposed to be able to be done in response to illegal migration or drug smuggling, of things that happen on a significant scale virtually all the time. It is sometimes said, well, maybe there's an invasion because there's a threat of terrorism. In the 50 years or so for which we have data, the number of Americans killed by terrorist attacks on U.S. soil by people who illegally cross the southern border is 0. That's right, the number is 0. That seems to me at least too low a number to be an invasion. It is also sometimes said, well, there are people on the terrorism watch list. The terrorism watch list is not what it sounds like. It includes large numbers of people who have never engaged in any act of terrorism or have any reason to do so against the U.S., but they had some sort of connection, or the U.S. government thinks they did, to various insurgencies in Latin America, in countries like Colombia or El Salvador and the like. So it's simply not the same thing as people belonging to terrorist groups that actually have any meaningful plans to attack the U.S. And similarly, the fact that some people or many people crossing the border are military-age males does not qualify as an invasion. Throughout history, migrants have been disproportionately younger males, and in this case, that category is defined as any male between the ages, think of 18 and 45. The obvious explanation for that is that those are people in their prime working years, and they want to cross in order to be able to find opportunities. The fact that somebody is a male in that age group does not mean that they're somehow unusually dangerous. So the bottom line is an invasion must be an actual operation of war, as James Madison said, and what is going on at the southern border is simply not that. Now, I'll talk also a bit more broadly about what can be done to address this situation in a way that's beneficial to the United States, to migrants, and generally reduce problems rather than increase them. The fundamental problem at the border is that by making legal migration virtually impossible for the vast majority of those who might want it, we have created a large black market, and it is predictable that people will try to engage in the black market, just as when we had alcohol prohibition. By making it nearly impossible to acquire alcohol illegally, we predictably incentivized people like Al Capone and others to provide it illegally, and similarly with the war on drugs today and with illegal migration. If you don't want cartels to benefit from illegal migration, make legal migration feasible, then people wouldn't resort to the black market in order to do it. Why has it increased in recent years? For two obvious reasons. One is we have a hot economy with a hot labor market, which predictably needs more workers, attracting people for that reason. Secondly, conditions in several of the major sending countries have gotten much worse. In places like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, we have socialist and communist tyranny, which has gotten even worse in recent years than it was before. In a country like Haiti, there's a vast outbreak of violence, and there's also severe economic problems in those areas. Combined with the hot U.S. labor market, that predictably leads to more illegal migration. We also know that making legal migration easier helps with the problems of disorder at the border. In January of 2023, the Biden administration introduced the CNVH program, which stands for Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Haiti. It enabled up to 30,000 people per year from those per month from those 4 countries combined to enter the U.S. legally and work if they have a U.S. citizen or a U.S. resident sponsor. In the months after the introduction of CNVH, illegal border crossings from those countries declined massively, by as much as 70% or more from some of them. But the figure went up again in the fall of 2023. Why? Because the 30,000 limit was reached, and so there was a massive backlog in these programs such that people entering the waiting list would have to wait years to get in. So once it became, again, for most of them, infeasible to cross legally, they had no choice but the illegal option, and frankly, I don't blame them. If you're a person suffering from horrible tyranny and oppression, and your only options are either to endure that for the rest of your life until perhaps you go to an early death, and the same thing for your children, or you cross the border illegally, I certainly would cross the border illegally facing with those two choices, and those people who are doing it, they're in that situation. So if we, as the CNBH program example shows, and other historical examples as well, if you make it easier for people to migrate legally, you will have less disorder at the border, you will have less black market activity, and so on. And allowing the legal entry has large benefits even aside from reducing problems at the border. One is immigrants contribute to our productivity and growth. They disproportionately start businesses at higher rates than native-born Americans. They disproportionately contribute to innovation of almost every kind, including scientific and healthcare innovation, and they also improve the fiscal position of the United States. The overwhelming evidence shows the vast majority of immigrants, including illegal immigrants, actually contribute more to the public fisc that they can take out, and we can further improve that ratio by making it easier not just to migrate, but to work. Most of the problems that you see with asylum seekers in cities like New York arise from the fact that under current rules, a person awaiting their asylum hearing is not allowed to work legally for at least 6 months, and in practice it takes longer than that. So of course, if you can't work legally, you face the choice of either working illegally, which leads to much lower income usually if you can do it at all, or of trying to depend on some kind of charity or welfare. So if you let them work legally, as the mayors of those cities are urging the federal government to do, then they contribute to the economy, they don't strain public services, and so forth. It is true that Milton Friedman at one point said you can't have free migration in a welfare state. He also said illegal migration is great because illegal immigrants are actually ineligible for most welfare benefits. Moreover, in a later interview, he admitted he had not thought of the possibility of simply limiting immigrant eligibility for welfare, which, by the way, we already do under the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. And even under current rules, people who are allowed to immigrate and work legally overwhelmingly put more money into the public fisc than they take out. Finally, brief word on Cesar Chavez. I think we should not base our economic and migration policies on the advice of a far-left socialist who hated free markets. And it is true, I'm a law professor. If immigrant law professors come in, I mean ones other than me, if they come in and compete with me, that's bad for me, but it's good for all the people who consume the services of law professors, and it's good for the economy as a whole. And so any negative effects that come from people who directly compete with me are usually offset by the vast improvement in the economy overall. Economists estimate that if you had free migration throughout the world GDP over time would double. We would have so much extra productivity. That's an enormous amount of wealth, and I would hope that we could capture at least a little bit more of it. Thank you.
Okay, so first question is for Professor Soman, actually focusing on SB4 for a second.
Yes.
So there have been various criticisms of the law. In your opinion, is the problem with the law itself, the criminal statute, or is it with the remedy, the removal power?
Yeah.
And so is it a problem that Texas actually passes a law, or is it a problem that Texas can effectively deport someone?
Sure. It's a good question. For those who may not know, SB4 is a law recently enacted by the state of Texas, which has many provisions that allow Texas to first detain undocumented immigrants and then deport them. And this is one of the cases where Texas is making the argument that illegal migration and drug smuggling qualify as invasion, though this is by no means the only argument in those cases. To my mind, in addition to the fact that the invasion argument is wrong, Texas's position suffers from a couple of weaknesses. There is a sense in which Texas is right, or at least I think is right, and which I'll get to in a moment. One problem is that under the Texas law, as the Fifth Circuit recently pointed out in their decision issuing a preliminary injunction against it, Texas authorities would have the power to deport people who actually have the right to remain in the U.S. under current federal law while their asylum cases are adjudicated. Another issue is that deporting people to countries that don't want to take them might raise foreign relations issues. I'm not entirely sure what I think about that, but it's at least a plausible argument that that interferes with the foreign relations power of the president. But there is an ironic way in which Texas is right, and if you look at the original meaning of the Constitution, as James Madison argued in the 1790s and Jefferson and others, it does not seem to give the federal government a general power to restrict migration. And in fact, in the founding era and through the first century of American history, it was actually mostly state governments that had power over migration. So if you go back to that original meaning, then it may well be true that Texas and other states would have the fairly broad power to deport migrants they didn't want, but the trade-off, of course, is that other more liberal states would have the power to accept migrants that the federal government might not want them to accept. I would be willing to take that trade-off of going back to the original meaning, but it's very unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to do that anytime soon, if ever. And until they do that, then federal immigration law does preempt state law when the two conflict, and at least I think significant parts of SB 4 are in conflict with current federal immigration law, particularly when it comes to asylum, possibly on some other issues as well. That doesn't mean that every single part of SB 4 is illegal under current federal law, but I think it's likely that at least significant portions are, which is why they have resorted to that invasion argument, because from Texas's perspective, the benefit of the invasion argument is that they argued that if there is an actual invasion, then the state can engage in war in response, even if federal statutes would otherwise forbid them from doing so. Sorry, there's a long answer, but it's a complicated case that has several different elements.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Attorney General Brnovich, so I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the Milton Friedman loves illegal immigration point, but I also want to ask you, what else this administration can or should be doing, in your view, to be stemming illegal immigration?
Well, first of all, I must admit, when I was listening to the law professor, I had a flashback to law school, and I remember one day I was bringing up a point to one of the law professors, and he said, yes, that's the way it works in reality, but will your idea work in theory? And so a lot of times we talk about these issues in theory, but here's the reality of what's happening. I think as Professor acknowledges, these are unprecedented numbers. And so I will get to the Milton Friedman thing in a second, but I just want to make sure we understand the context. So when he's making an economic argument about the people that are coming in predominantly being, males because they're working age, they want jobs, I think we all appreciate that. But what he didn't address is when 13 million people can come into this country illegally and, get transportation, hotel rooms, hearings set for 5 years later, why on earth would 1 million people cross, risking their own lives in the desert, trying to conceal themselves, wearing camouflage, trying to evade capture detection? Why would they be doing that? And I would submit to everyone in this room that that's because they're not here to go work at a fast food restaurant. They're not here to work in the hospitality industry. They're here for other reasons, and I think we all know why. And if you look at the amount of unprecedented violence on our southern border, if you talk to the border sheriffs, for example, they will tell you the number of car pursuits has increased 2 to 3-fold. They will tell you the number of cross-border shootings has dramatically increased. If you talk to ranchers and farmers, these are tough people, 4th, 5th generation Arizonans that I've met along the border. They will tell you that they have never seen so many armed young men crossing through their property and their ranches. So this is definitely unprecedented. And, I don't want to make this debate be about Milton Friedman. I only pointed out the Milton Friedman quote because I know a lot of my libertarian friends worship at the altar of Milton Friedman, as, maybe they should, because he was an amazing economist. But the reality is the professor pointed out in his own remarks, is that, then Milton Friedman started making a distinction about, well, you're not eligible for benefits if you're in the country illegally. The problem is, all you've got to do is open the New York Times or any major publication in this country, and you will see that not only are states and cities handing out thousands of dollars in benefits, you have even the federal government providing housing, you have hospitals having to provide free health care, you have luxury hotel rooms that are being cleared out so people that have entered the country can illegally, or entered the country legally, can stay in those hotels. And I am just pointing out, and even when I mentioned the thing about Cesar Chavez, is that it's fundamentally unfair to the migrants, and it's fundamentally unfair to American taxpayers. And anybody that's recently been to a city like San Francisco or Los Angeles or New York, when you look at the amount of homeless problems and the other problems we have in this country right now, they will tell you, even with our veterans, that the priority should be on making sure before we assimilate or have any more immigration, whether it's legal or illegal, we need to take care of the problems domestically. So in sum, I also want to bring up one point. So I think I addressed the Milton Friedman comment because, quite frankly, people here are getting benefits. I mean, heck, I think New York City is talking about allowing people to vote that have entered the country illegally. So I think that even under the quote he just gave up, Milton Friedman would not approve of what is happening now. So lastly, I want to mention one other thing about the invasion. Look, the reality is that, the professor brought up James Madison. Literally, during the Virginia ratification debates of the United States Constitution, James Madison, the example he used in those ratification debates was smugglers, rum and molasses smugglers off the coast of Virginia. And he said during those debates, of course, Virginia can protect itself from this invasion or this illegal liquor coming in. They have a right to affirmatively do something to protect themselves. And it's one of the reasons why I would just say, I think we all agree in this room, wherever we fall on the spectrum, that the words of the Constitution have to mean something. So when you look at Article 4, Section 4, when you look at Article 1, when you also look at Article 1, Section 10, dealing with exports and import, the export-import clause, and the ability of states to monitor what is coming into their states, those goods. Even when you look at that clause, if the Biden administration wants to create another port of entry, a 28th or 29th port of entry in Texas, they have the ability to do so. What the state of Texas is arguing, and other states are arguing, is that you first and foremost have to enforce the existing laws as they are, and if you don't, the states are not engaging in immigration enforcement. What they are doing is using their powers in the Constitution to protect themselves, and all you have to do is look at, in recent history, every time there's a riot in Los Angeles or somewhere else, or there's a, terrible natural disaster like flooding, states do what? They call in the National Guard. They mobilize their National Guard to protect the public and to protect the citizens. So what Texas is essentially arguing is that if Joe Biden refuses to enforce existing laws, and states like Texas are being overwhelmed on so many different levels, then the state has a right to defend itself and defensively engage in defensive actions to stop the flow of illegal drugs and people coming into this country illegally that are being supported by the gangs and the cartels.
Thanks. So we'll do a quick lightning round and then open it up, make sure we can open it up to questions from the audience. So President Biden recently commented that his people are examining whether or not he has the unilateral power to close the border. Do you all have thoughts on this legal inquiry or the timing of it? I figure if his folks are watching, maybe they can get the benefit of this panel. So let's start with Dr. Dasgupta.
Could you please repeat the question?
Sure. Does the president have the unilateral power to take action to close the border?
Under the Constitution or under some statute? So we, in the Trump administration, Title 42 was a pretty capacious statute, which went back, I believe, almost a century. And that was invoked in order to shut the border because, not entirely, but to a very large extent, in order to protect the public health angle of national security at the time.
Thank you. Professor Soman?
I suppose it depends on what is meant by closing the border. He certainly does not have the unilateral power to completely shut down all trade and migration at the border. He does have various other powers to do other things. We could talk about details later. But the fundamental problem, as I said before, is that what you have is a vast black market that has been created to make it even more of a black market by making legal migration even more difficult than it already is, would simply predictably create more of the same effects on a larger scale. It is actually not true that Biden has simply said we're going to let everybody into the country. He's actually deported more people than were deported in a given equivalent period under the Trump administration. He has also reintroduced asylum rules that are in some ways similar to those of the Trump administration. Those rules are being litigated, but for the moment, the Ninth Circuit has actually let them be enforced. The fact that there are these deportations and the like, and that millions of people do get caught and deported, is one reason why the military-age males, and actually some people who are not military-age or male, also do cross in areas where they hope to remain undetected. And it is also why we have not, in fact, seen the formation of some large army of terrorists or spies or whatever. Rather, these people cross, and yes, many of them do, in fact, end up in the boring work of working at fast food restaurants and the like, which we might think is not great, but it's much better than their available alternatives. And that's also what asylum seekers in the cities would do. It's not like they're living high on the hog on expensive hotels and the like. They're in a bad situation because they're not allowed to work legally. The cities are in a bad situation for that reason. If we did let them work legally, that is what the vast majority of them would do.
I can't help but think of the old Mark Twain line that there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And so who are you going to believe, the professor or your lying eyes? Because the reality is that this is an unprecedented crisis at our southern border. If you just look at the raw numbers, if you look at, we talk a lot about economics, if you look at the price of fentanyl, for example, it's dramatically declined. It's declined by 75% in the Southwest. And anytime you get more of something and it's cheaper, you're going to end up with more people dying, especially in a dangerous drug like fentanyl. So the question was, should President Biden, can he do anything? The answer is yes, of course. Of course. I mean, when you look at what happened during the Trump administrations, the numbers were declining. But I don't want to make this even about Trump versus Biden, because the reality is that if you look at the Obama administration, look at the Bush administration, when there was issues related to, every time Congress talks about passing a law that's going to grant amnesty or this is going to happen, we start to see a surge. And what's happened historically, it starts with just enforcing the existing law. 2005, the Bush administration implemented Operation Streamline, which aggressively prosecuted people for illegally entering the country. There was a surge. Not the surge in Iraq, but there was a surge at our southern border with prosecutors and federal judges, and the numbers dramatically declined. The numbers of people entering the country illegally dramatically inclined, because people that were coming into this country illegally knew that if they had been convicted of a crime, their chances of ever getting a green card or citizenship were none. And so you can create incentives, you can create disincentives. And in the first month of the Biden administration, there was, depending on how you count it, 10, 11 executive orders that did everything from stopping the building the border wall, ended up revoking, the Remain in Mexico policy. When I was AG, we had sued the Biden administration at one point because they wanted to give more authority for DHS to grant amnesty and take that or expand it from immigration judges, which, once again, you worry about the politicization of this issue. What's happened is, the incentives that people are responding to right now is they think that there's no consequences to breaking the law. They think they're going to be rewarded, that they're going to have the ability to get these 6-month or year-long transitions with free housing and free health care. And so what's happened is the federal government, the White House, President Biden, have created all these perverse incentives. So the simple answer is it starts with enforcing existing law. And you can't address the broader issue of what do you do in the future with the border until you stop the flooding that's overwhelming the boat right now.
If anyone has questions, please come up to the two microphones. But I've got another question for Dr. Dasgupta. So what does the future look like for legal immigration? Professor Soman is talking about expanding legal immigration so that you tap down on illegal immigration. What does the future look like for legal immigration?
I think that, you know, it's very interesting when one of the most fecund channels of talent pouring into our country, talent coming into our country, are H-1B visas. And H-1B visas are for highly skilled individuals from, you know, often from China, India, elsewhere in the world. And there's a country cap involved. And the country cap is calculated based on how many applicants, and I mean, part of the calculus is how many applicants, what is the need, and so on and so forth, in which I believe the Department of Labor and USCIS, which is part of DHS, they engage and they calculate that. And over time, the backlog there has become colossally long. You know, now for some of those, I know that for Indian immigrants, it can be 20, 25 years to get your green card. Chinese immigrants, I've been told, is slightly shorter line. And so, you know, that might be something for Congress to address.
I see a question.
Yes, Professor Soman, you said, I think your problem with SB4 with Texas was that it uses the idea of war or like violent attack improperly because it doesn't address, it's not what the original meaning of that was based on the kind of response that they're using it for, I think. And so if that is the case, is there another way that you think is an acceptable way to respond practically the same way that uses some other sort of legal means?
No. So to be clear, the invasion issue is not a problem with SB4 as such, but it's a problem with one of the arguments Texas is using to defend SB4 in court, because they're saying even if SB4 is otherwise preempted by federal law, we get to do it because under the invasion clause, we can engage in war in response to illegal migration and drug smuggling and the like. If you set aside the argument and just look at SB4 itself, then the legal problem with SB4 is that it conflicts with current federal immigration law in various ways. That might not be a problem if you go back to the original meaning under which the federal government has only very limited power over immigration, and that power is mostly up to the states. But it is a problem under current Supreme Court precedent dating back to the Chinese exclusion case, which says that the federal government has nearly unlimited power to restrict immigration. I think that Chinese exclusion case was wrong, but it's unlikely to be overturned anytime soon. And therefore, if you accept the idea that the federal government does have power over immigration, it turns out that at least significant parts of SB4 are in conflict with federal laws, particularly when it comes to asylum and some other things as well. So that's the problem with SB4, at least under current Supreme Court precedent. And there's also a problem with an argument they've advanced to get around that first problem. That is the argument that illegal migration and drug smuggling qualify as an invasion, which is both contrary to the original meaning and has dire implications if courts were to accept it, such as that states could essentially attack their neighboring countries anytime they want, and the writ of habeas corpus could be suspended by the federal government at virtually any time.
I would just add to this that it's important to note that the federal government does, as I said, they're at the apex of president, his or her power when it comes to dealing with immigration. But states like Texas are not trying to enforce immigration law. What they are saying is they are using their authority that's explicit in the Constitution to repel what they believe constitutes an invasion, and they've set forth those arguments. I will note that, you know, we talk a lot, you know, as lawyers, as judges, about, well, what do these words mean? And, you know, you go back to that, you know, meaning of what constitutes an invasion. So I just want to note for the record, or for anyone else listening there, that according to Webster's 1806 dictionary, the first American English dictionary, invade is broadly defined as meaning, quote, to enter or seize in a hostile manner. Webster's 1828 dictionary also defines invasion or invade broadly to include not just an entrance of a foreign army into a country, but also to enter as an enemy with a view to conquest, plunder, attack, to assail, to assault, to attack, to infringe, to encroach on, to violate. And so I think when you look at those words, they have the effect of what is going on, and I would invite anyone that, to go to the border firsthand and see what's going on, and you will see that, and like I said, I don't say this lightly as a first-generation American, but it's heartbreaking to see what's happening at our southern border and just the chaos that's ensued in the last 2 or 3 years.
Just a brief point. I think those definitions, pretty much all of them do actually refer to warfare as an entering as an enemy. There were then, as there are now, secondary definitions of invade, such as invading someone's rights or the like. But again, you have to look at the context in which it is used, which is the context of engaging in war in response, or also a context of rebellion and the like. James Madison and others made clear that that's what it is. The Attorney General earlier referred to another quote by James Madison about using militia to deal with smuggling, but that was not a reference to the invasion clause. That was a reference to the power to call forth the militia to enforce ordinary laws. That power is in the Constitution, but it's distinct from the invasion clause, which is not merely a power to use, say, the state National Guard for law enforcement purposes, which Texas can do if it wants, so long as the laws in question are not otherwise unconstitutional. What Texas cannot do in response to illegal migration or drug smuggling is engage in war under the invasion clause. I can't resist noting, since we've been talking about smuggling and Milton Friedman, that one other thing that Milton Friedman opposed was the war on drugs, which is also at the root of many of our problems at the border. That perhaps could be a whole additional discussion, but if we don't like the current situation with fentanyl, the war on drugs is at the root of it. It's a predictable effect of a war on drugs, that a so-called iron law prohibition, that over time the drugs that people take illegally become stronger and more dangerous. This was predicted by many, including by Friedman, and we are reaping the consequences of engaging in a war on drugs.
Drugs might be the next conference, so we'll wait
I'm
for
sorry.
Yeah, that's
Hi, this question is for Professor Soman, but I would appreciate responses from other members of the panel if they so choose. I think a lot of people appreciate, in this room at least, appreciate market solutions to problems, and you talked a lot about sort of applying a market-based approach to immigration, but the nature of markets, at least as I understand it, is that they do have losers. There are winners and then there are losers, and for all of the benefits of the sort of general benefits of immigration you mentioned, starting businesses, et cetera, I would think there are at least some people who in some way do lose, whether it's because their wage was depressed by a more competitive labor market, or because they lose their job entirely somehow, or simply because the place they live suddenly has a lot more people who are very different from them in many ways. So my question is, do you acknowledge that there are at least some losers in addition to winners that emerge from the immigration process? And if so, how do you help the losers from a legal or policy perspective?
Sure. Of course, I acknowledge that there are losers. In any large-scale social process, there are always some losers. That's virtually unavoidable. I would say two things about that. One is there are vastly more winners, both immigrants and also natives, including natives whose lives are literally saved by migration because it creates more innovation of almost every kind. For instance, immigrants are disproportionately at the root of various kinds of medical and scientific innovation, which saved millions of lives, including recently in the COVID pandemic, where the first two vaccines that were allowed by the FDA were both developed either by immigrants from third world countries or the children thereof, thereby saving millions of lives. With freer migration, we could have more of that. To the extent that there are losers, I would say a couple of things. One is it's not possible to avoid losers entirely in any market system. Secondly, to the extent that you want to provide assistance to losers, the vast new wealth created by migration can help us do that. In my book, Free to Move, in Chapter 6, 6, I talk about how, for instance, if you think there is a category of native-born workers who are negatively affected and you want to help them, you could have a larger earned income tax credit to give them whatever amount of compensation you think they're due for having worse job prospects. You can create other kinds of benefits for them. That's much better than spending a vastly larger amount of money trying to keep migrants out, creating a large illegal market, helping organize crime, and depriving ourselves of the many economic benefits of freer migration. It's better to use some of the wealth, including that created by migration itself, to help whatever losers you think are deserving of that assistance, rather than by adopting a set of policies which confine migrants to lives of poverty and oppression and deprive native-born Americans of the large economic benefits of migration.
Next question.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ed Morrison. I'm a 2L at George Mason University, and I really appreciate this panel. I'm actually missing one of my last evidence classes to be here because I'm very interested in this. And I stepped out earlier to take a phone call. I'm hoping I didn't miss it, but I want to ask your guys' opinion for any of you, especially Mr. Attorney General as a state actor or prior state actor, what you thought about when the Supreme Court told Governor Abbott to stand down and allow his Border Patrol agents to cross, and he generally disregarded that order. Did you think that was within his power to do during the Article 4 talks, or was he out of line on that one? Just curious.
Questions? Do you want to start? Attorney General
So
Bernabet?
the professor can
first, or I
start.
can go ahead.
Apparently filibustering anyway, so why doesn't
No,
he
no,
start
please
the
go
next
ahead.
question? No. Every time I say something, you got to get another 5-minute response. So this time I get to go last. All
Okay,
right.
if you want me to go first, it's fine. I don't have much to say about that particular case other than that technically what happened there, I think, is that the posture there was not that there was an order against Texas from the court, but rather that there had been an order, an injunction against the federal government engaging the actions that it was engaging in, and that injunction against the federal government was then lifted by the if I remember, or stayed by the Supreme Court. So while I'm not a fan of the things that Texas has been doing in this area in general, here there was not actually an order or an injunction against Texas for the governor to disobey. So far, at least, he's not in that case disobeying any injunction. It's all yours.
I would just say that as someone that's prosecuted cases in federal court, and for full disclosure, I'm actually married to a federal judge, that no one in their right mind disregards an order of a federal judge. I think if you do, you should plan on bringing your pajamas and toothbrush to court the next time you go. So I do agree. This is good. We're agreeing on something. I do think that technically Texas didn't violate any order, and I don't know if you heard this discussion earlier, but when Arizona, when we issued an opinion, when I was AG, we clearly set forth the arguments as to what the states can and can't do. And I clearly believe that one of the things the state has a constitutional ability to do is, in order to repel an invasion or to make sure in Article 1, Section 10, the goods and services are coming through the right ports of entry, is they have the ability to erect barriers and to essentially, create, like I said, barricades to stop people from entering their states illegally. The other thing I will just add, because I know we're short on time here, I believe the speaker's speaking soon, right, is I just want to leave, or I'm not going to say anything else, but I just want to leave everyone with one last thought on this, is that there's a lot of talk about the economics and the cost benefit. The last person asked a question about, the winners and losers. But here's the reality. There's sometimes costs you can't measure. And one of the things that I have talked about a lot, is that as a first-generation American, if I moved to Poland tomorrow and lived the rest of my life there and died in Poland, they would be like, oh, this is the American, who came back to his Slavic roots. That's what it would say in my obituary. I was really into the martial arts. In fact, there's a video people like to play of me doing my nunchucks, and I'm very proud of that. I almost moved to Japan before I met my wife, and I wanted to live in Japan and, study the martial arts. And if I had lived in Japan the rest of my life, I would never be Japanese. I could never become Japanese. So what's so amazing about this country? No matter who you are, where you come from, how you spell your last name, you have the ability to become an American. We don't have a national church. We don't have a Church of America. We don't have a Vatican. We don't have a common ethnic identity like many countries in the world do. And that is something special. And I worry all the time, even going back to this question about whether, Governor Abbott violated or didn't violate a judicial order, is what holds this country together. We don't have a national church or national religion. It's our documents. Those are our sacred documents, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And when people start overwhelming the system and we don't have any sort of common understanding of what the rule of law means, what the Constitution means, that social fabric is really, really easy to start tearing apart. And that's why I believe wholeheartedly in the right of people to protest. But less than 25 years after 9/11, you have people in New York with Hezbollah flags and people in other states chanting "Death to America." Clearly, there's something wrong in our immigration system where when people come here, at least previous generations, they wanted to become American. They, wanted to assimilate. Didn't mean they didn't, keep their roots and customs, but they tried to assimilate. They tried to believe in and live the American dream. And I worry right now because so many people are coming over unvetted and given status here that they're not assimilating and accepting the notion that the Constitution and the Declaration are our founding documents, and they need to respect those. And when that leaves, I just worry as Americans, we ain't got nothing else left. So I think it's important for reasons you can't put an economic price on that we need to enforce our existing immigration laws.
Thank you. And with that, we're at time. So thank you to the Federalist Society for hosting, and thank you to the wonderful panelists for this discussion.